I want to teach you something about what a proof is, what a proposed proof is, and what you do about it. People hear the word proof and they're all ready to roll over and play dead. Well, it's proved, so it's got to be true. In logic, we have two criteria that we use to evaluate proofs. One is that the proof should be valid, meaning that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And the other is sometimes called the proof being sound, which means in addition to being valid, the premises are true or known to be true. And that's very important because you can have a valid proof which leaves you options what to do about it. Aristotle used the proof, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's certainly a valid proof. So is all men are Republicans, George is a man, so therefore George is Republican. That's also a valid proof. If all men are Republicans, and George is a man, then George must be a Republican. That's right. That's valid. But of course, your reaction to the first and the second is going to be very different. The reaction to the first is, so now I know Socrates is mortal. And the reaction to the second is, listen, maybe George isn't a Republican because not all men are Republicans. When you have A and B imply C, you're left with a choice. Accept A and B, and therefore accept C. Or if C is outrageous, reject C, and opt for rejecting one or both of A and B. Really, you have a third possibility, and that is to reject logic's claim that A and B imply C. That if A and B are true, C must be true. You have that option also. So someone who offers you a proof leaves you options, and often it's not obvious which option you should take. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. Now, this I've got to do on the board. But this is long enough, I think, not to strangle me or to destroy it. There's a famous so-called proof that 1 equals 2. Yeah, that 1 equals 2. So you start with the assumption that A equals B. A and B are just names for the same number. Then you square both sides. You have A squared equals B squared. Then you subtract B squared. I'll have this one. One second. No, sorry. This is an eraser, right? Yeah. Oh, it works pretty good. Multiply both sides by A. Get A squared equals AB. Then subtract B squared from both sides. A squared minus B squared equals AB minus B squared. You know, an equation, you can do the same thing to both sides. It remains equal. Now here you factor out B, so you get B times A minus B. See, then B times A is AB, and B times minus B is minus B squared. Now this factors, you don't have to know this, you can look this up. This factors to A plus B times A minus B. You multiply them together, you're going to get AB minus B squared. A squared minus B squared. So now you have an equation with these, and you have A minus B on both sides. So divide both sides by A minus B, and you get A plus B equals B. Now, we started off with something that A equals B, so I'm allowed to put in B for A, so you get B plus B equals B, then you get 2B equals B, and then you divide by B on both sides, and you get 2 equals 1. Now, I don't care whether you follow the steps or not, whether you're convinced by the proof or not, but what would you do if you faced this? Here a guy comes in, and he says he's a mathematician, and says, I have discovered a proof that 2 equals 1. Here it is, all the steps, everything pure algebra, and the conclusion is 2 equals 1. What do you do now? You say, wow, math is great, look at that. Math discovered that 2 equals 1. Is that what you say? Or do you say, 2 can't equal 1, period? There's got to be something wrong with the proof, and if I don't find it for 1,000 years, there's still something wrong with the proof. 2 can't equal 1. I'm much more positive that 2 doesn't equal 1 than I am that all these steps are genuine. And even if I can't find the fault, I'm betting that there's a fault above and the bottom is wrong. That's a fair move. It's not avoiding, it's not irrational, not a person not willing to acknowledge the truth, because the proof only sets up a tension between the premises and the conclusion. If the conclusion is outrageously false, you have every logical right to say, I don't trust the material in the proof. Does anybody know where the failure is here? Yeah?
A equals B?
No. In math, you got two names for the same thing. Very often the question is, are they equal? They're not equal. You have to prove one. They can often prove that A equals B.
A minus B.
Sorry, what?
In the fourth one.
This line?
Yeah.
What's wrong?
I think the factor from A squared minus B squared is
Doesn't equal this?
I mean, the fifth one is absolutely wrong, of course. But
Oh, I see. Well, let's just start with the fifth one then, because the fifth one is absolutely wrong. Well, of course, because the conclusion is wrong. But now listen, let me teach you something about logic. You don't object to a proof by saying the conclusion is wrong. That's not logic. I want to know why it's wrong. I want to know where the failure in logic comes. We all know that this is wrong. That's not a surprise. The question is, where was the mistake made? Somewhere in these lines is a mistake. Where is it? Yeah, well, you've seen this before, right? No?
Well, okay, but he also did it before. So.
Well, okay, so... But
So we had a student come in here and hurt me with this. So, but I didn't know how to solve whatever. Now, I will just say that A plus B equals B step can make sense if A is 0.
Again, what are you doing? You're saying this step also doesn't make sense. Well, okay, I got that. But the question is, which move is a wrong move?
No, I'm saying that step might actually make sense. That's what I'm saying.
Of course, it could be if they're all three of them 0, huh? Right? Okay. But look, going from here to here is the mistake because you're dividing both sides by 0. A minus B. What is A minus B?
0.
If A equals B, then A minus B is 0. You're dividing by 0. You can't divide by 0. Right? Is that obvious that you can't divide by 0? 5 times 0 is 0, right? If you divide both sides by 0, you end up with 5 equals 1. You can't divide by 0. Dividing by 0 is not defined. It's a wrong move in number theory. Okay, but my point is not that this is the mistake. My point is, even if you never found the mistake, you'd never agree that 2 equals 1. 2 can't equal 1. That's obvious. And you have there's nothing forcing you to accept the conclusion, now let's say, of a proposed proof, a purported proof, a hypothetically presented proof. Nothing forces you to accept the conclusion. It's perfectly valid to say that the conclusion is outrageous and therefore I don't accept something in the beginning of the proof, and you may not be able to find out what it is. I'll give another example. This was famous in ancient philosophy. A fellow named Zeno claimed he had proofs that nothing moves. Nothing moves. All of your experiences of motion are an illusion. And here's he had 3 proofs, but here's one that is somewhat intuitive. Let's suppose things do move. Then you could have a race. You know what a handicap race is? Suppose you're racing 2 people, 2 horses, whatever it is, against one another, and you know that one is slower than the other. Well, that's a bore. You know who's going to win before it starts. So you give the slower one a head start. Then the question is whether the faster one will be able to overtake the slower one before the end of the race comes. So then it becomes exciting again, even though they are not equal runners. Okay, so now let's suppose you have a handicap race. One guy starting here and one guy starting here. All right? Now we're going to divide the race into stages. Stage 1, the guy behind goes up to the point at which this other one was starting, but during that time that he moves up, he also moves up. That's stage 1. Stage 2, the one behind moves up to where the one ahead got to, during which time the one above was ahead. Stage 3, can you guess what stage 3 is? I'm sure you can. Stage 3, this one moves up to where the other one was, during which time this one was ahead. Stage 4, is it a surprise? Stage 4, the one behind moves up to where the one ahead was, but during that time, when the guy's catching up, this one is moving ahead. Stage 6, stage 7, stage 8, isn't it always going to happen that way? The one behind will move up, and the one ahead will move a little ahead. Oh, you say it gets less and less ahead? Yeah, it does get smaller and smaller. That's true. But in every stage, the guy behind moves up to where the other one was, and in that stage, he moves ahead. At what number stage does the one behind pass the one in front? 2,463? 9,841? At what number stage does the one behind get ahead of the one who's ahead? Never. Because at every stage, it starts out with one behind, and in the next stage, he moves up to where the other one was, but while he's moving up to where the other one was, the other one is moving ahead a little bit. So there's no stage at which he gets ahead. Now, people thought about this for 2,300 years. That's a long time. A lot of smart people in 2,300 years. No one found, on all that time, a conclusive reason why the argument is wrong. Do you think anybody in 2,300 years began to wonder, well, maybe he's right. Maybe really nothing moves? Somehow that didn't occur to people. They knew there's got to be something wrong with the proof. They just had a lot of trouble saying what it is.
How does that prove that nothing moves?
Because if things moved, then you could have a race like this.
You couldn't have a race like that?
If things really could move,
Yeah.
if motion was real, then you could have a handicap race where the guy from behind overtakes the guy from in front of him. Happens in our world all the time, right? If this is impossible, then all motion is impossible. You can't divide this from other motion.
If this is impossible, then motion is impossible?
Yeah. The only way it could be impossible to have a handicap race is that nothing moves. There's nothing preventing handicap races particularly. If any motion is possible, it's possible to have a race like this. Nothing's stopping this race of this particular type. At any rate, that's another example of where you have a proof, or at least it's parentheses at a proof. The logic seems compelling. Lots and lots of smart people try to figure out what's wrong with it, but the conclusion is outrageous. And at that point, it's fair to say, I'm sorry, the conclusion is much more outrageous than my confidence in the rest of the proof. So I'm confident there's something wrong with it, and there's nothing wrong with that. Not irrational, it's not avoiding. It's a question of what I would call logical balance, where one has to know where the strength of the premises and conclusion lie, so that you can know what's rational to do, presented with what looks like a proof. Now, this applies in a lot of life. You probably have heard of people who think that there's no such thing as objective morality. Nothing's really right or wrong. People think so, communities think so, it's periods in history, and it's subjective and it's relative, which aren't the same, but they think they're the same, and so forth and so on. All this kind of stuff where just, and then if you're really into these things, they tell you the truth is relative also. Everything's relative, except that everything's relative. That's not relative, is it? Better not be, huh? Because then it'd be okay to say that things aren't relative, because that's relative to me, that they're not relative. It does get a little complicated if you try to think it through. Better not to think it through. Just throw rotten tomatoes. So somebody says that I don't believe that that morality is objective, and I'm going to show it to you, prove it to you. Before he starts, ask yourself, how do I feel about murder is wrong, rape is wrong, genocide is wrong, shaming is wrong? How do I feel about that? Am I sort of non-committal? Maybe yes, maybe no, who knows? I'm not sure. I go through different moods. Maybe murder is okay, maybe it isn't okay. Is that how you feel about it? I doubt it. I think that this is one of the clearer things in life. That premeditated, unprovoked murder is wrong, evil. I'm prepared to celebrate people who prevent it. I'm prepared to condemn and penalize people who commit it. Somebody says, I have a proof you're wrong. I think you should meditate and say, you better have a very, very good proof. You better have a proof based on very solid, obviously correct things. Otherwise, whatever you tell me, whatever reasoning you give me, I'm going to be more inclined to think there's something wrong with your reasoning than to think that murder's okay. Even if I can't point out what's wrong with your reasoning. I'm going to be more inclined to think that murder's okay and you're making a mistake. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. This may sound weird to you. It is weird. For about 200 years, philosophers all believed that there's no such thing as the physical world. Everything is just an idea in your mind. Everything is just an experience. Beyond your experience is nothing. G.E. Moore, a famous professor at Cambridge University in England, used to tell his students, this is a silly philosophy. It's a dumb philosophy, and I'll prove it to you. This is a hand, my right hand. This is my left hand. I have hands. According to the people who think there are no physical objects, I don't have hands. Therefore, they're wrong. So students would say, but Professor Moore, they won't accept that you have hands. And he said, I know that, but ask yourself, what are you more sure of? Their philosophy or that you have hands? Which are you more positive about? Their philosophy is based on all sorts of sophisticated premises and clever logic and nuanced distinctions, and then there's your hands. I think you're right to say, I'm much more sure that I have hands than I am that all your reasoning is correct. You have 6 pages of complicated paragraphs of reasoning, and I have hands. Thank you, that's not convincing. Even if I can't tell you what's wrong with it. This is a matter of keeping your balance. Now, to give you one example, and then I'll turn to an example in our sector. This idea of objective right and wrong, there are those people who want to argue on the basis of evolution that there's no reason to believe in right and wrong as objective. Okay, I'm condensing volumes of material into a very simple presentation, but the logical point was made by Thomas Nagel, and he's one of the experts in the field. So they say, look, people who think there's right or wrong, people who are trained that there's right or wrong, will do various things. They'll cooperate, they'll give way to one another, their joint defense and their joint economic productivity will be enhanced by thereby. Therefore, they'll have more children. Evolution is all about greater reproductivity. We could see how evolutionary pressures would give rise to moral commitments even if they aren't true, because it's not the truth of the moral commitment that makes the cohesiveness of the society and the superior defense and the superior economics. It's the belief that they're true, not their being true, that makes it so. So we can explain how the belief in moral values, moral rules, could come about and be propagated and become fixed in society without there being any question of whether they're true or not. They don't have to be true for that to happen. And therefore, there's no reason to think that they're true. So Thomas Nagel said, I'm hearing your argument, and I'm asking myself, what am I more sure of? That evolution works like this, and evolution could provide the explanation, and the explanation won't depend upon the truth of the things that we believe, so it's completely independent of the truth. That's one proposition. Versus, murder is wrong. Which one am I more sure of? Seems to me I'm much more sure that murder is wrong than your evolutionary explanation and its conclusions. So I'm going to use my commitment that murder is wrong to say that your explanation is wrong. True, if I credit the logic, which I just said as a footnote, you could question also. If I credit the logic, then the evolutionary explanation and murder is objectively wrong conflict with one another. But if I have to choose between them, I think your appeal to evolution is very speculative. I think it's very imaginative. I think it's very hypothetical. And my commitment that murder is wrong isn't speculative and imaginative and hypothetical. So I don't think that that's a good enough reason for me to give up my belief on the grounds of your proposed argument. And in fact, Nagel pushed it just a little bit further. Think again of what they say in the name of evolution. And evolution could explain where morality comes from, even if it's not true. Just examine those words. Evolution could explain. They didn't say evolution does explain. They said evolution could explain. What lies between the could and the does? Does would mean these animals were under these conditions and these genetic changes took place, and that's how this feature got fixed, and then they were under those conditions and these types of interactions favored their survival and reproduction, and that was fixed by that gene, and so forth and so on. Do they have the story, the genes, the animals, the conditions, the utility? No. Their proposition is evolution could explain it. If we had the right animals under the right conditions and the right genes, we would have an explanation. If we don't really have it, we only point out that it could have it. Well, that's not the same as saying you really have it. And Nagel is saying, I don't think it really would work. You say it could, I say it didn't. It certainly didn't. That's not the way it was produced. There must be much more to the production of our rules of morality than just the evolutionary story. And you don't even have a detailed evolutionary story to present. So that being the case, if there is an incompatibility, the incompatibility works the other way. It's a good reason to think that there isn't an evolutionary explanation. You say there could be, I think I don't have to agree with you. If you presented the actual explanation in detail, that would be something else, but you don't do that. So this is an example, again, of weighing up the evidence against and the argument on the one hand against the conclusion, and asking yourself, what is more solid? I was just mentioning, I'll take questions for a little bit. This doesn't mean that something's absolutely solid by you can't be disproved. That you're entitled to have a kind of dogmatism about the things that are most solidly held by you. That's not true. Even though in a proposed proof there's a tug of war between the premises and the conclusion, and if the conclusion is more clearly false to you, then you don't have reason to credit the argument. There's a way to force you to rethink the things that you are most positive of. And one way to do that is to put you through a procedure whereby you acquire new, very positive things which conflict with the old, very positive things, and forces you into a dilemma. Because not only do you have positive beliefs, but you have positive reliability of certain processes of producing beliefs. For example, you are now all in possession of the belief that this room has tables in it, which you, if you came in tonight for the first time, didn't have before you moved in. You came in, you sat down, and you know there are tables here. Perception gives you new beliefs which are very solid, very, very solid. So if you believe A, and A is top-notch and very hard to challenge A, because for you A is very, very certain, but if I put you through an experience which leads you to accept B, and B is very certain, and A and B conflict, then you might reconsider A, even though A is at the top of your belief chain. Because the top of your belief chain doesn't have only one thing in it. And this actually happened. Is the earth in constant motion? In particular, do the heavens revolve around us, or do we rotate on our axis? Either one can explain what you see. Tell people that the earth 2,000 years ago, the earth is moving, and the answer you get is, what have you been sniffing? What have you been injecting? The earth is moving. Can't you feel that it's stationary? You can feel very well it's stationary. If the earth were moving, you'd feel the wind whipping through your hair. But the wind isn't whipping through your hair because it's not moving. How still can you be? Right? I have a theory. The air is pulled along by the earth. Yeah, without nets, without poles, without sails, it's pulled along. Boy, you have a good imagination. Right? When I drop a rock from a tower and I let it falls exactly straight down to the base of the tower. If the earth were moving, when I let go, the earth should move out from under it. It should fall further away or crash into the tower. That doesn't happen. No, the stone's being pulled along by the motion of the earth. I see you have quick verbal answers that rely only on imagination to escape the examples that I give. Those aren't going to be convincing, but do an experiment with a pendulum. Start a pendulum swinging. In 24 hours, the plane of the pendulum swinging goes all the way around. You can watch it. What's going on? Started swinging this way, and then it's swinging this way, and then it's swinging this way, then it's swinging that way. What is going on? Leprechauns pushing it around? What makes a pendulum change its plane of motion? Oh, what happens if the earth's rotating out from under the pendulum? It's we who are moving, not the pendulum. Now you got something you saw with your eyes. Your eyes produce real knowledge, solid knowledge, top core knowledge, and the pendulum's definitely going around. Now go explain that with a stationary earth. That's going to be hard because there's nothing pushing it. So that's how you can call someone's top level belief into question, even though it's top level, because you can create other top level beliefs which are equally strong and they conflict, and then he's got a problem that he has to resolve. So it's not dogmatism, it's conservatism. It's corrigible conservatism, which is one of the major stances in epistemology. So now, if someone proposed for you a proof or a proposed proof about something, first thing you ask yourself is, how outrageous is the conclusion that he wants to prove? And by that, you set a stand for how strong the proof is supposed to be, how strong the premises are, how well they're known, how well you're committed to them, so as to measure whether they're going to be strong enough to change your mind about the conclusion. Now, let's take an example of an argument that was going on for thousands of years. There is no God because of the presence of evil, the existence of evil. And the old argument, which has been gratefully has been discarded in the last 80 years in modern philosophy because it was conclusively refuted. The old argument went like this. You think of God as having three essential characteristics. God's all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. Well, if he's all three of those, there can't be any evil. Because if he's all-knowing, he would know about the evil. And if he's all-powerful, he could eliminate the evil. And if he's all-good, he ought to eliminate the evil. So if he has all three of those qualities, there ought not to be any evil. But it's obvious that there is evil, and therefore there is no God. That is one of the most classic atheistic arguments that's been repeated thousands of times. Now understand, this argument comes to the conclusion there can't be a God. Nothing answering the description of God exists. We have a proof that such a thing cannot be. So I think we should ask, this applies, by the way, to the atheist as well as to the theist. This is a proof that it can't be. Not that it just doesn't happen to be, but that it can't be. It's impossible, because it violates the definition of what God is. So the first thing I think we would ask is, all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. Do we have well-accepted definitions of those terms? Or are they controversial? Good is horrible. It's full of controversy. But all-powerful, as some of you know, we've gone through this, is quite tricky to be able to define. And all-knowing, to know what knowledge is, to what it means to know everything. And then putting all three of them together. And then evil. We say there is evil. Do we have a good definition of evil? And how exactly do you identify evil? How do you know what's evil? Are we really positive that everything that there are things in evil which really are evil, that we aren't making a mistake? Or maybe the logic is wrong. Maybe it's possible Maybe it's possible that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, and there really is evil, and it's not a contradiction. Do we know that it's a contradiction? It's not like 2 equals 1. I think it's very fair to say, I'm sorry, you're proving something monumental, that the existence of God is impossible. You're using terms about which we're not very confident that we understand them well, and we're not positive about the term of evil in particular, and also we're not really positive about the logic. I'm betting that there's something wrong with the logic. That's not an irrational position to take. One doesn't have to roll over and play dead because of this kind of argument. The argument is much less certain than the falsity of the conclusion that they want to establish. And indeed, it's the logic of it that has led to many refutations of this argument. So I'm really concerned about the balance of that you're supposed to have in confronting something like this. But let me just give you an example of where some of the argument goes. Let's see, all powerful, all knowing, all good, therefore there mustn't be any evil. What would you say if there were a spectacular good which couldn't exist without using an evil means? What should an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing agent do if there is a spectacular good that can only be brought into existence through evil means? What would the all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing agent do? Give up the good or use the evil means to get the good? Is it obvious what the answer is? No, it's not obvious. It's not obvious that you give up the spectacular good because an evil means is needed. Let's suppose the amount of evil is fairly small and the amount of good is spectacular. The argument that's presented is that there should be no evil at all, period, under any conditions, for any purpose. That's why God is impossible. All of a sudden, it doesn't sound so convincing. What would you do if you had all power, all knowledge, and you were trying to do the best thing? Would you obviously give up that spectacular good because it cost some evil? Would that be the best thing you could do? The right thing to do? I don't think it's obvious at all. But then all of a sudden, the argument is not nearly as strong as it sounded, not nearly as strong as that's presented. So, but my point was, even before I told you that, you should have been suspicious. There's too much that's fuzzy, too much that's poorly understood in the argument for me to trust it for such a spectacular conclusion. It doesn't have the strength to create that kind of spectacular conclusion. Now, this happens across the board. Yeah. A question?
Oh, I guess I did. Yeah, I was just saying, couldn't this framework also be used to avoid certain reductio ad absurdums? So for example, if I'm talking about, let's say, utilitarianism, and they hold maximizing pleasure is good. A classic example we could respond with is just saying, oh, if you have 10 people on an island or whatever, right, and one of them, and all nine people want to torture one person, then would they be able to do that? Could they say, well, yeah, intuitively that may be a critique, but at the end of the day, even though it's intuitively, even though it's strong, my intuition still holds that maximizing pleasure is good. So that couldn't the inverse be true, where you could just avoid these absurd scenarios by holding true to some intuitive principle here?
Well, I do think that we're appealing here to people's honest, self-understanding description of where their mentality is. When these objections became popular in the middle of the 20th century, there was a very fine philosopher, J.J.C. Smart, who tried a paper like that, but he got laughed out of the academy. You're not really right. I mean, there's no question that utilitarianism is a theory. It's a theory that universally describes all good and all right action. That's a gigantic commitment. Universal theories like that have all sorts of consequences you didn't dream of beforehand. And this case of the island, and there are loads of other cases as well. You ask anybody, if you were to count yourself in an honest move, you say, am I really going to affirm? By the way, you didn't say it right. It's not that they are allowed to torture him; they're obligated to torture him. according to utilitarianism, they're obligated to torture him. That's insane. That's insane. That you're evil if you don't torture him. Because that's the way to maximize pleasure. Right?
But again, when the principles stay true here, if the case with the handicap the handicap case you gave with the racing, if I say, for instance, yeah, I hold motion to be true, but I hold this conclusion to be absurd. When the same case be here, you're holding the whole theory of motion to be true, that you could have motion, but also reject that conclusion. At least if I understood the example that you demonstrated.
No. If motion is possible at all, then there's nothing prohibiting a handicap race which could result in the one behind overtaking and passing the one in front. That happens in real life all the time. The only objection you could have to the possibility of handicap races is that nothing moves. That's why he chose it as an example, because if you believe in motion at all, there's absolutely no reason to believe, yes, other motions are possible, but something here stops handicap races from working. You never run to try to overtake somebody who's ahead of you, because you can never do it. Right?
You're saying the size of the theory would be determinative of whether...
No, I'm talking here about a particular case of people on an island, and saying that 9 are obligated to torture the 10th. That sounds outrageous. Yeah. What do I have in opposition to that? All good is pleasure. All rightness of action depends upon maximizing pleasure. Those are universal statements about all possible conditions and all possible situations. Universal statements like that are well known to have unforeseen consequences, which weren't taken into account when they were made. And then, force equals mass time acceleration. Well, not the way Newton thought, because he didn't know about relativistic mass. He didn't know about the relativism of different frames. So, that's a universal statement. Universal statements, because they carry so much content, are very risky. Right? The case of the island is a very specific case. Right? And I say Smart tried to accommodate it, but and there are many other examples of that kind, where you say, I don't know about your theory, but this is wrong. This is wrong. So when you have arguments against the existence of God, or against the existence of Yiddishkeit, you have to ask where they're coming from. For example, you have many critiques of Yiddishkeit which are based on, they don't tell you this, but if you look at their logic, they're based on the assumption that the Jewish people is not different in any significant way. All the tools of psychology and sociology and anthropology and economics, all the tools that we use for studying the Chinese and studying the Nigerians and the Eskimos and the South Africans apply to the Jews as well. There's no difference between any group and any other group. And given that assumption, we come to certain conclusions. Well, maybe the assumption is wrong. And indeed, what would you base the assumption on? How would you, if somebody asked you, why are you applying what you know about other cultures to the Jewish people? Why are you doing that? Would it be because it's not politically correct to do otherwise? Okay, good, we'll laugh you out of the class. Is it that you've tried your methodology on the Jews and you found that it is definitely explains the way in which the Jews have operated in certain respects, and since you see that your method has produced true explanations, therefore you're trusted for more true explanations? Is that how you did it? I'd like to see you do it with respect to Jewish survival. Tell me how you explain 3,000 years of Jewish survival of the culture. Tell me what you see in common between the history of Jewish survival with ancient Greeks or ancient Assyrians or the Egyptians or the Romans or the Chinese. So show me where, for example, here's an axiom that they use. All cultures are affected by other cultures. A small, weak, divided population is very susceptible to influence by other cultures. So Judaism must have been affected by other cultures. And therefore its ideas must be traceable to other cultures that influenced them to develop them down the line. Trouble is, if you try to use that principle to describe a nation that is in exile for 1900 years, that principle predicts that they won't survive at all. Jews were in Yemen for 1,500 years. They were in Poland for 1,000 years. The environments, physical and social and political, were very, very different. If you think that cultures are affected by their majority societal circumstances, you should have predicted that at the end of those 1,500 and 1,000 years, there's next to nothing left in common between Jews in Yemen and Jews in Poland. And it didn't work out that way. So there's a test of your methodology. If your methodology gives you the wrong answer, then maybe it's the wrong methodology. You can't just assume that the method works for everybody. Not if you're an empiricist, not if you believe in opening your eyes and looking at the world in real terms and checking whether it's right or not. I realize that isolates a small minority, but I'm talking to the small minority. If you're interested in that and you get the wrong prediction, there's an overlap between the ideas of the Kabbalah and Lavdil, the Neoplatonists. Gershon Sholem made a big deal out of seeing how the rabbis were affected by the Neoplatonists and so forth and so on. One of his students, Moshe Idel, wrote a book, New Perspectives on Kabbalah, and he said, maybe the truth is the opposite. Because the roots of the Kabbalah are found clearly in the Midrash and in the Talmud. That antedates Neoplatonism. If there was contact between the rabbis and Neoplatonists, maybe we affected them, not they affected us. But if you have as an axiom that small, isolated, and separated populations are going to be affected by the majorities in which they live, you won't even consider that. It won't even occur to you. Because we were the small, powerless, etc. But when you look at the fact that theory predicts dissolution and it didn't happen, then you step back and say, well, maybe. So again, you have a fact that the Jewish people has survived. You have a contrasting fact that we're going to treat the Jews just like everybody else, but then everybody else didn't survive. Only the Jews survived. So you're going to treat us just like everybody else. How are you going to account for the difference between the fact that we survived and they didn't? And if you continue blindly to take the same principles and apply them to us, you're not going to get credible conclusions. This is all a matter of keeping your logical balance. Okay, a couple more questions. I've got to run.
So I want to come back for a moment to those three premises four premises for the God argument. And I want to look at the all-powerful one there and how that might be a little bit flaky in of itself. Because regarding what you said, what if there's a good that can be achieved but with a small amount of evil? If you're all-powerful, wouldn't it be the case that you could achieve that same good or a greater good and just subtract the amount of evil? Why doesn't that work?
Because in some cases, the necessity of the evil for the ultimate good is not physical necessity or economic necessity or atomic necessity, it's logical necessity. And it is not, we went through this once in great detail, and I've written about it, and it's on recorded material, that we don't describe God as doing things that are self-contradictory. We don't describe God as making or being able to make square circles, and so forth and so on. And so in certain cases, the description, this good without the evil, is a self-contradictory description. I do that in detail. So, but it's a good question. But and the failure of a logical contradiction is not that, well, that requires a lot of power, and God's just too weak for that. He's strong enough to move the planets around, but he isn't strong enough to fight with logic. That's not the argument. The argument is that if you use contradictory words to describe what God should do, you aren't making sense. You're just talking nonsense. To ask why God doesn't make square circles is like asking why doesn't God blah. Square circles doesn't describe anything. First thing you have to do is take responsibility to make sense when you talk. After that, we can discuss whether you're right or wrong. But if you're not going to take responsibility to make sense when you talk, there's no point in talking. Yeah?
Curious, just to make sure I'm following your argument right, one of the examples you brought up, and I revisit and ask about that, it was with the Evolutionary Argument for whatever moral anti-realism,
Yeah.
something along those lines. So in a case where if we assume evolution to be sufficient, if we assume it to be a sufficient theory, wouldn't the evolutionary explanation of someone's intuitions about, let's say, moral beliefs, about murder being wrong, wouldn't that kind of make it a credible counter? Because they could just say, well, the reason why you hold that belief in the first place is because of evolution.
Yeah, but that's not the issue. The issue, the claim is evolution can explain, not does explain, can explain why you hold that belief, even though it isn't true. And I say, if you are correct, then there's no reason for me to think that murder is wrong. But I'm much more convinced that murder really is wrong, and that I'm not making a mistake, than I am convinced that your explanation explains where my belief comes from. It's particularly because you're only claiming that it could do the job. By the way, think of this. Let's suppose you have a phenomenon and you say, well, this could explain it. Does that exclude the possibility of something else also being able to explain it? Couldn't two contradictory theories explain the same thing? Sure it could. That's why it's hard to find crucial experiments between the theories, right? Not that they're not both true. They're just both capable of explaining it. So the fact that something's capable of explaining it doesn't make it a true explanation.
The more evidence you give towards evolution, the more would it increase the probability of the claim that evolution is, or evolutionary processes are undermining your moral beliefs?
Well, it depends what you mean by more evidence for evolution. Maybe more evidence for evolution of snails, maybe maybe not. Right? I mean, there are people who think that evolution is just a joke. Okay? I don't think just a joke. It's a joke. It's not just a joke. It's a joke with some other things as well. Right? I can defend this in detail if you like. I have done so. It's on record. Right? In fact, somebody took a video of Dawkins and a video of my critique of Dawkins. I didn't even know Dawkins had this on. I read his stuff, right? And he put them together, and you can Google it. Dawkins speaks, and then I speak. He put it together. I think it turned out I answered Dawkins point by point, and it's gotten some interesting reviews. So I think there's one question is, does evolution ever work, and is it ever adequate? But the second question is, does it apply to mathematical knowledge? I mean, to moral knowledge. I'll leave you with this. Wouldn't evolution apply to mathematics also? Isn't it because we evolved in certain ways that we came to have mathematics? Does that mean that 2 + 2 = 4 isn't really correct? Isn't really objective? Isn't really realistic? Because it came about through evolution? Probably not. But then, how much weight does an evolutionary argument have? Okay.